I paid $5 for a shack that looked like it would collapse if a crow landed on it. That was the entire transaction. No bidding war, no competing offers, Northwest real estate agent adjusting his tie in a glass office somewhere explaining market conditions and comparable sales. Just me, a folding table inside a county courthouse basement, a board clerk who had clearly processed 100 of these on slow Tuesday mornings, and a property deed that transferred ownership of 43 acres of Mojave Desert scrubland for the price of a fast food meal. She stamped it twice, slid it across the table without looking up, and said, "Next." I drove home that afternoon with the deed on my passenger seat, occasionally glancing at it the way you glance at something you are not entirely sure is real. 43 acres. My name on a document. $5. It had started, like most strange chapters of my life, with an idle Tuesday afternoon and an internet rabbit hole. I had been reading about county tax auctions, properties seized when owners fail to pay taxes, then offloaded by municipalities that simply want the liability cleared from their books. Most listings are unremarkable. Overgrown suburban lots. Flooded parcels nobody can build on. The occasional crumbling urban structure that would cost more to demolish than it is worth. But buried in a California county database, between a landlocked strip of commercial zoning and a parcel described only as inaccessible seasonal wetland, I found it. 43 acres in the Mojave. Minimum bid, $5. Zero competing interest registered. The photograph attached to the listing showed almost nothing useful. Desert scrub stretching to a low ridge, a sagging structure in the foreground that the county listed generously as a single-room dwelling, and a sky so bleached by heat it had lost all color. I stared at that photograph for a long time. Not because it was beautiful. Because something about it felt deliberately empty, like a sentence with a word missing. I submitted the bid that evening. Nobody countered. The drive out was 4 hours from the city, the last 40 miles on a 2-lane road that eventually became a 1-lane road that eventually became a track of packed dirt cutting through Joshua trees and pale rock. My GPS lost confidence somewhere around mile 30 and began offering increasingly uncertain suggestions before going quiet entirely. I found the property by matching the listed coordinates to my phone's compass app, pulling off the track beside a leaning wooden post with a rusted metal tag that bore the parcel number. I stood outside my car for a moment and just listened. The Mojave has a particular silence that is different from other silences. It is not peaceful exactly. It is more like the silence of something that has been waiting for a very long time and has grown comfortable with the wait. The wind moved through the Joshua trees with a low, papery sound, and somewhere distant a bird called once and did not call again. The shack was worse in person than in the photograph, which is saying something. 3 walls of plywood so dried and warped by decades of desert sun that you could see daylight through the gaps. The 4th wall had partially given way, leaning outward at an angle that suggested one firm wind from completing the job. The corrugated tin roof was still largely intact, which seemed almost miraculous. The tin itself rippled and darkened to the color of rust in places, silverish and scoured clean by sand in others. Someone had put a padlock on the door at some point, but the wood around the latch had contracted so severely that the door simply swung open when I pushed it, the lock still attached and useless, guarding nothing. Inside, the floor was concrete. That was the first thing that caught my attention, because nothing else about this structure suggested anyone had invested in concrete. The walls were scrap lumber. The roof was metal sheeting. But the floor was a solid, professional concrete pour, gray and dense, still structurally sound in a way the walls emphatically were not. I crouched and ran my hand across it. Smooth. Professionally finished. Completely inconsistent with everything around it. I told myself it was simply the most practical choice for a desert floor. Packed earth would shift and crack in the heat, and a concrete slab would stay level and keep moisture out. That made sense. I told myself that, and I believed it, and I stood up and walked back outside to look at the ridge line and think about what I might eventually do with 43 acres of absolutely nothing. I spent 3 days out there that first visit, sleeping in my car, walking the land in the mornings before the heat became serious. The property had a strange quality that I kept trying to name and kept failing to name accurately. It was not beautiful in any conventional sense. There were no dramatic formations, no water features, no views that would make a painter reach for a canvas. It was flat scrubland rolling toward a low ridge, dotted with Joshua trees and pale granite boulders and the occasional dried skeleton of something that had not survived a past summer. But it had a gravity to it. A wait. I kept finding myself drawn back toward the shack even when I intended to walk in the opposite direction. On the second evening, sitting in the open doorway of the shack as the desert cooled and the sky moved through its extraordinary sunset sequence of orange and deep red and purple, I looked down at the concrete floor again. The crack running down the center, which I had initially registered and dismissed, looked different in the low slanted light of late afternoon. Shadows collect in cracks and exaggerate them, so I moved closer and looked more carefully. The crack was deep. Deeper than typical settling or heat expansion would produce. And it ran in a straight line with a precision that natural cracking does not tend to achieve. I followed it with my eyes from one end of the slab to the other, then traced perpendicular lines where the crack met the walls. I got down on my knees and looked at the edges more carefully than I had before. The crack was not a crack. Or rather, it was not only a crack. Along two sides of what I was now recognizing as a rectangular seam, the concrete surface showed faint but unmistakable tool marks, the kind left by deliberate cutting rather than stress fracturing. Someone had scored this floor. Someone had built a seam into it and then filled that seam with material designed to look like ordinary settling damage. I sat back on my heels and looked at that rectangle for a long time. It measured roughly 4 feet by 2.5 feet. Large enough for a person. Large enough for a person carrying something. I pressed both palms flat against the concrete surface and pushed down, then sideways, testing for any give. Nothing moved. The slab felt as solid as bedrock. But when I pressed my ear against the concrete, and I recognize this sounds like the behavior of someone who has lost perspective, but I pressed my ear against the concrete anyway, the surface felt different on one side of the seam than the other. One side had the dead, dense stillness of ground. The other side had the faintest, almost imagined quality of space beneath it. Not empty space. Not a void. But a different kind of air pressure. The quality of a sealed room. I drove back to the city the next morning with the deed on my passenger seat again, but I was not glancing at it the same way anymore. I was already making a list. A crowbar. A good flashlight. A pry bar with a wider head. I was already thinking about what kind of concrete tool marks would be left by a pneumatic hinge mechanism versus a simple lift panel. I was already thinking about the previous owner, who had vanished without a trace 7 years ago and left 43 acres of desert to a county that sold it for $5 without anyone asking too many questions. I was thinking about how deliberately empty that listing photograph had looked. How there had been 0 competing bids. How the county clerk had stamped the deed twice without looking up, as if she had been told to process it quickly and without discussion. I was thinking about how the padlock on the door had been completely unnecessary given the condition of the walls, unless the point of the padlock was never to keep people out of the shack. Maybe the point was to make people look at the door instead of the floor. I drove 4 hours back to the city and spent a week doing nothing but research. Property records. County survey maps. Satellite imagery. The land had changed hands twice before the original owner acquired it in 1987. Before 1987, the parcel did not appear in county records at all. Which meant before 1987, it belonged to someone who did not file with the county. There is only one category of landowner in the American desert who does not file with the county. I booked another trip out for the following weekend. I packed a crowbar, 2 pry bars, 3 flashlights, and enough water for 4 days. I was not afraid. That surprised me, honestly. I expected to feel afraid, and instead I felt the clean, focused pull of something I had not felt in years. I felt like I was about to find out what the missing word in that sentence was. I pried the edges with a crowbar for 2 hours before the concrete slab lifted on a pneumatic hinge, engineered, deliberate, still functional after God knows how many years. That moment, the moment the slab moved, is difficult to describe accurately. There was a sound first. A deep, pressurized exhale, like the desert itself had been holding its breath for 50 years and had finally decided to let it go. Cool air rose against my face, and in the Mojave in July, cool air rising from the ground beneath a rotting shack is not something your nervous system processes calmly. I stumbled back a half step. The slab continued rising on its hinge, slow and mechanical and completely certain of itself, and I stood there in the doorway of a $5 shack watching a door open in the earth like something from a dream you cannot quite convince yourself was only a dream. I gave myself 60 seconds. I had promised myself that before I drove out, if something opens, give yourself 60 seconds before you go closer. Respect the moment. Let your eyes and your brain reach an agreement about what they are seeing before your body commits to anything. I counted the full 60 in my head, standing absolutely still, while cool pressurized air continued to flow upward and the fluorescent lights somewhere below began their slow, humming climb toward full brightness. I could see the top of a steel ladder. I could see the first few rungs descending into pale, flickering light. I could see a concrete wall below, painted the particular institutional green that belongs exclusively to mid-century American government construction. On the count of 60, I went closer. The ladder was 14 rungs. I counted them going down, one hand on each side rail, my flashlight tucked under my arm even though the lights below were handling things adequately. Old habit. Never trust the only light source in an unfamiliar space. At the bottom of the 14th rung, my boots hit a sealed epoxy floor, and I turned around slowly and understood for the first time the true scale of what I was standing inside. The space was enormous. Not enormous in the way that surprises you briefly before you recalibrate, enormous in the way that takes several full rotations to absorb, where each time you think you have grasped the dimensions your eyes find another corner, another corridor entrance, another wall further back than the last one. Later, when I paced it out methodically, I measured the main chamber at roughly 90 feet long and 60 feet wide. The ceiling height was 11 feet. Every surface was poured concrete reinforced with visible rebar, the construction so dense and deliberate that it conveyed a single unmistakable message: whatever was built to happen in this room was built to survive things happening above it. I did not move for a long time. I simply stood at the base of the ladder and looked. Along the eastern wall, a bank of radio consoles ran the full length of the room. Vacuum tube equipment, analog dials, frequency displays with hand-labeled tape beneath each one. The chairs in front of the consoles were still positioned as if the operators had simply stood up and walked out during a shift change, intending to return after coffee. A ceramic mug sat on the console surface beside the third chair. I crossed the room and looked at it without touching anything. The residue inside had dried to a dark ring decades ago. Someone had been drinking coffee at this desk. Someone had set their mug down, pushed back their chair, walked to that ladder, and never come back. The maps were on the northern wall, pinned directly to the concrete with steel fasteners driven into the surface. They were large-format topographic and strategic maps, the kind produced by government cartographers rather than commercial publishers, and they showed a geographic scope that made the back of my neck tighten. Soviet missile trajectory arcs overlaid on North American landmass maps. Blast radius projections centered on major western cities. Wind pattern analyses for fallout dispersal. These were not the maps of people monitoring a situation from a safe distance. These were the maps of people who understood they were inside the situation, who had calculated exactly what the ground above them would look like in a range of specific scenarios, and who had built this room accordingly. I stood in front of those maps for a long time, tracing the arcs with my eyes without touching the paper. The shelving units along the southern wall held supplies arranged with military precision. Sealed metal containers stacked in rows, each one labeled in black stencil. Materials dated 1973. Medical supplies. Water purification equipment still in original packaging. A case of replacement vacuum tubes for the radio consoles. Batteries in sealed foil. Notebooks, unopened, beside a crate of ballpoint pens. Whoever had stocked this room had stocked it for a long stay, and they had done it with the systematic thoroughness of people who did not expect resupply once the door sealed behind them. Then I found the logbook. It was on the desk at the center of the room, a heavy government-issue binder with a red cover and a classification stamp on the front that I will not reproduce here because I am still not entirely certain of the legal considerations involved. The binder was not locked. It opened easily, the pages inside crisp and almost perfectly preserved by decades of climate-controlled, sealed air. 12 personnel names on the first page. Ranks, identification numbers, assigned roles. A mission designation I did not recognize. Below the personnel list, a start date, March 1971. I turned to the last entry. October 14, 1974. A single paragraph in neat, unhurried handwriting. The author noted equipment status, atmospheric readings, communication log summaries. Standard operational language, clipped and professional. The final sentence read, awaiting further instruction per revised protocol. Morale good. And then nothing. The next page was blank. The page after that was blank. Every remaining page in the binder was blank. Awaiting further instruction. Morale good. 12 people had been in this room in October 1974, doing their jobs, maintaining their equipment, drinking coffee at their consoles, writing in their logbook, and then the entry simply stopped. Not urgently. Not mid-sentence. The last entry was as calm and routine as every entry before it. They had written their notes for the day, set down their pen, and the log had never been opened again. I sat in one of the console chairs and stayed very still. The question that kept forming was not the obvious dramatic one, not what happened to them, not where they went, not why the facility was abandoned. Those questions were there, certainly, and they were not small questions. But the question that kept rising above the others, the one I could not set aside, was more specific and in some ways more unsettling. Why was this land sold at public auction for $5? Facilities like this do not get abandoned by accident. They do not slip through bureaucratic cracks and end up in county tax databases. The government does not misplace underground Cold War installations. The paperwork that surrounds a facility of this classification and this scale is not the kind of paperwork that simply fails to get filed, that somehow results in 43 acres quietly passing into public auction records one unremarkable year with a minimum bid that ensured nobody would look closely. Either this facility was deliberately released, scrubbed from active records, allowed to lapse, handed off through a chain of quiet administrative steps that ended with a county clerk stamping a deed twice without looking up, or someone made an error so significant it is difficult to imagine how their career survived it. And the previous owner. The man who had acquired this parcel in 1987 and then vanished without a trace in 2017, leaving no family, no forwarding address, no estate filing. He had owned this land for 30 years. He had known what was beneath it. He had to have known, nobody lives with a $5 shack on 43 acres of Mojave scrub for 3 decades without eventually pressing their palms against that concrete floor and feeling the difference in air pressure on one side of the seam. So he knew. And then he disappeared. I called my historian friend that evening, sitting at the base of the ladder with the bunker spread out behind me and the square of fading desert sky visible above. She is the kind of person who has spent her career in archives, who gets quietly excited about declassified documents the way other people get excited about sports results, and she listened to everything I described without interrupting. When I finished, the line was quiet for long enough that I checked my signal bar. "You need to understand," she finally said, "that land wasn't sold by accident." I asked her what she meant. She asked me if I had found anything with a specific designation. She gave me a sequence of letters and numbers I was not expecting, a combination that meant nothing to me. I told her I would look. She told me to call her back before I called anyone official. She said it twice. Before you call anyone official. She was not being dramatic, she is constitutionally incapable of drama, which made the repetition considerably more serious than drama would have been. I climbed back down the ladder after the call and walked the full length of the main chamber one more time in the quiet hum of 50-year-old fluorescent lights, looking at the maps and the consoles and the coffee mug and the logbook open to its last entry. 12 names on the first page. Awaiting further instruction on the last. I was going to find out what instruction never came. And I was beginning to understand that whatever I found, someone had already decided, a long time ago, with great deliberate care, that it should stay exactly where it was. 14 rungs underground. In the dark. In the desert. In a $5 shack that was never really a shack at all.